Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. When I was researching this panel earlier, I came across a report from the Reuters Institute for Journalism from 2012, 5 years ago, called Reporting Global Trade, Is It a Dying Art? I think it's safe to say that trade journalism is in pretty rude health today, not for particularly happy reasons. As we meet now, the rest of the G7 is trying to convince Donald Trump to sign up to language in the communique battling protectionism, something that was matter of course at previous such summits. There are protectionist forces on the rise across Europe and other parts of the world. We have Brexit, the departure of a pro-trade nation from the most comprehensive trading bloc the world has ever known. So it's an interesting time. To help explain why trade has suddenly become sexy, please welcome our panel. First of all, we have Stéphane Dion, soon to be Canada's ambassador to Germany and special envoy to Europe in the EU, and a former Canadian foreign minister. To his left, we have Carole Lanoux, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for European Policy Studies, which is a think tank in Brussels. To Carole's left, Barry Lynn, who runs the Open Markets Program at New America, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And finally, Pippa Malmgren, who's an author, former special assistant to President George W. Bush, and is currently sitting as a non-executive member of the board of the new Department for International Trade in Britain. So welcome to them. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to anyone watching online, including on Facebook. Stéphane, maybe I can start with you. We have some people suggesting now, including the Director General of the World Trade Organization, that we are in danger of slipping into a new era of global protectionism and even into trade wars. Is that something that you think is a possibility now?
Yes, it's a possibility, but the first thing I would like to say, if we look at the experience of my country, is that it's not new that you have resistance about free trade. In fact, if I compare the debate in Canada about free trade with the United States in the 80s, and today about the possibility that we'll negotiate against this free trade agreement with the United States, in the 80s, it has been a very difficult debate in my country. All the left was arguing that free trade with the United States is the end of Canada. It was an existential debate. It was a debate about who we are. Will we keep our country together? Will Ontario continue to feed the other provinces when they will not have an interest to do so because they will trade with the United States and not the Canadian provinces? Now, decades after, it seems that we'll have to maybe renegotiate NAFTA. It seems quite clear now. Almost nobody in Canada sees that as a good news. The support for free trade is all over the place. We may disagree about different aspects of the agreements we are signing, but it's a strong consensus. We went through a debate on CETA, the agreement with the European Union. Yes, you have some resistance among agriculture, the unions, the left-wing party, the NDP. But overall, it went well. And the two main parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, work on it. I would say something, though. When the Liberals came with Justin Trudeau, the negotiations were stalled because you had a lot of resistance in Canada, but especially in Europe. There was the sense that this free trade agreement is towards a horse to negotiate one with the United States. So Canada is just a fake. The danger is the United States. There was the sense that it will be a race to the bottom regarding the environment, worker rights, food safety, and so on, that governments will not be allowed anymore to regulate and Parliament to legislate. So what Justin Trudeau said, he said, okay, let's talk about that. How can we fix it? So we strengthened a lot of chapters on environment protection, workers' protection, social safety net, and the dispute settlement mechanism is not involving directly the firms, the companies anymore. It will be government-to-government decisions, who will be arbitrators of any disagreement we may have. And this helped a lot, I would say, to make this treaty acceptable. So in the resistance we see today about free trade, I think it's very important to be inspired by what we have negotiated, the EU and Canada, to have progressive trade, not only to put the tariffs down, but also to be sure that governments and parliaments will do their job, regulate and legislate for good. We don't have to choose between trade and progress. We need both. That the main point, I would say, in order to address the concerns we see around. We should not ignore them. We should not say, you don't understand, trade is good for you, we'll do it. We need to have trade agreements that are progressive trade.
So, Carol, that line that we've just heard about CETA is one that you often hear in Brussels. This is a model trade agreement. It's a model for the next generation of trade agreements. It's something that Europe, at least, should seek to emulate in its arrangements with other potential trading partners. And there's lots of ambition now over talks with Japan, over talks with clubs like Mercosur. Exactly. On the other hand, there are clearly strong protectionist forces across Europe, and not just in the countries that they're sort of the old usual suspects like France, but particularly in places like Germany and Austria. So how do we sort of juggle these polarities? Do you think that Europe, particularly if America is starting to withdraw from its traditional support for global trade, do you think Europe can be the new champion?
Europe is certainly trying to be the new champion, or has been the new champion for kind of open trade for the last, many years, I would think, rather 2 decades or more, because until very recently, let's say, we were in favor of a global multi-trade agreement, let's say, but then I think we're one of the last blocs really accepting that we had to move the bilateral route rather than the multilateral route. But you have to see there are a bit competing forces, but probably what is most remarkable, what has happened recently is, of course, the elections in France, and let's say this joint press conference of Macron and Merkel in Germany about 10 days ago, where both were exchanging views on how do they see this, and basically towards, I would say, a form of a Europe-first policy, and insisting both of them, we need to have full reciprocity. Of course, the reciprocity was in the debate in Europe already a bit somewhere in the early 90s, but has never been applied, really applied. It is foreseen in many pieces of regulation at European level, but the reciprocity means, let's say, you'll only have access to our market if you have similar access to the other market. And then we think, probably not only about the United States, but we may think about China, which has taken over quite a number of companies in Europe recently. But do we have, as Europeans, the same access to the other market? So that came up in that debate between the two. So, of course, it's too early to make an analysis about this, what this means for the longer term. I think, I would say, on the immediate future, we will see the EU trying to further complete bilateral trade agreements. We had an important court statement this week regarding what is the capacity for the EU to almost, as the EU, to decide on trade agreements. In that case, it was with Singapore, but which is also very important for the Canada trade agreement, for the Japan agreement, which we're dealing with. So, and recognizing that for the pure trade-related issues, the EU has an exclusive competence, which is extremely important because there are some national parliaments who wanted to take this back from Brussels and to say, you don't have this role anymore. No, it's purely an EU treaty competence that on pure trade-related issues, the EU has the only competence. Of course, what is the problem I think I've seen over the last years is that the EU has not been sufficiently open, not been sufficiently transparent in explaining what it was doing. And that came up essentially with TTIP, of which CETA was the victim in the debates which we've seen between September, October, until December, until an agreement came. What we have neglected to do, and that is more broader part, let's say, of how this EU structure works, is that the EU has these exclusive competences, but is not explaining or is not saying what it's doing. And I think for us, let's say the best example is that the TTIP agreement is sold on the basis of one impact assessment. Can you imagine such an important agreement like TTIP? The Commission has done one big impact assessment on that to say, look, this is why we are in favor of this. But for such a great trade agreement, you say we argue this on the basis of one piece of, say, academic research. You can't do this. We have, by the way, as a think tank ourselves done our analysis of that analysis, but of course others have come out in the meantime, but these things cannot happen. Let's say for a competent administration, they have to much much earlier opened this up to debate, which certainly in the case of TTIP, I think in the meantime, 4 years ago, they hadn't done. Of course, the Canadians had hoped, let's say, to fare quietly and that it wouldn't come up, but then it exploded. And now I think the Commission, I hope, has probably learned a lesson, is saying in the context of Brexit, which is the third big difficulty which we have, that in the context of Brexit, they will be fully transparent. However, in that context, we may also see a tendency towards more a form of protectionism because, as you know, the EU is taking a very hard line on Brexit. So if you're no longer in the single market, we'll have to conclude another trade agreement with you. So basically, what is then the reference is another form of a CETA agreement with Britain.
Yes, I'm sure we'll get into Brexit in more detail. Barry, we need to talk about Donald. He withdrew from TPP, as he promised to. As we heard earlier, he'll be aiming to renegotiate NAFTA. And there have even been rumors that his administration is going to threaten not to abide by certain WTO rulings. From the outside, this looks like a pretty grave threat to the global trading order. Is it as serious as it looks?
Yes and no. And I think it's actually a great opportunity for us to sort of reconceptualize what the trading system is and what its purpose should be in a way that allows us to sort of wield trade more effectively to promote sort of peace and prosperity among nations. Just a little more background on sort of my group. As Tom mentioned, I run a program at a think tank, a large think tank in DC called New America. But what my program really focuses on, it's called the Open Markets Program, we focus on the revolution that took place about 30, 35 years ago in how we approach competition policy. So we look at the effects of concentration of economic power, monopolization, and how it affects us economically, how it affects us politically, how it affects the stability of complex systems. And we do this both sort of domestically within the United States, and we do it also internationally, looking at a trade policy essentially as an extension of anti-monopoly policy, which is traditionally how we approached it in America. And so, there were 2 books that I've done. My first book was really about looking at sort of the effects of concentration on the international system. That came out in 2005. It was called End of the Line. It was looking at how concentration makes systems unstable. It makes them subject to crashes. And the second book was Cornered, and that looked at how the effects of concentration on us politically and economically. But the short story of what happened is that 35 years ago, under the Reagan administration, the United States changed how we think about competition policy radically. We went from being America's where modern anti-monopoly policy was born. And this goes way beyond the Sherman Act. This goes back to the origins of our country. We wanted to fight private concentration of power because that's how you set people free. And we did that pretty well for 200 years, with the exception of the period around the plutocrats. The Reagan folks came in, and they came in with this neoliberal idea. They came in with sort of the Chicago school approach to economics. And they used that to upset how we deal with concentrated economic power. They basically set people free, corporations free to concentrate power. That has led to a revolution in the structure of economics in the United States. And just to be fair to anyone who worked in the Reagan administration, this was not only a Republican project. The Clinton administration followed directly in the pathway of the Reagan administration, and what the Reagan administration had not unleashed, the concentration that the Reagan administration had not unleashed, the Clinton administration did so. And actually, what the Clinton administration did, this is one way to sort of get to the point of reconceptualizing what the trade system is. One of the things that the Clinton people did, 1994, 1995, when they got to sort of signing on to the Uruguay round of GATT, is they carried the revolution in antitrust into the international trade system. And the fundamental thing that was affected 1994, 1995, was the shifting of power to regulate trade away from one corporation called the nation state, which in our most of our cases happen to be democratic corporations, to a non-democratic corporation called the business corporation. So what we saw in 1995 was a radical shift in governance to people whose goals were to serve their own interests, and their goals were to, one of the ways they did that was by concentrating economic power and often concentrating capacities, vital capacities. So as we kind of, and one of the effects of when you concentrate vital capacities is, again, the fact you end up with systems that are subject to catastrophic failures. This is true in finance, it's true in the industrial system. So I think as we, the opportunity here, now that Trump is kind of like rumbling and, sort of about jobs and about the need to reconceptualize the trade system, is actually take him at his word and really reconceptualize the trade system and go back to its initial purposes, which was to use trade as a form of anti-monopoly policy, to distribute capacity, to distribute opportunity, to break private power, to set people free.
Thank you. Pippa, I'm sure you have one or two thoughts about what's happening in the States, but right now I want to ask you about Brexit. You're based in London. You sit on the board of the new Department for International Trade. Brexit, from the outside, looks peculiar. The largest, deepest, most comprehensive trading bloc the world has ever known, Britain, a traditional champion of free trade, it chooses to leave. And soon, assuming that the negotiations get this far, we're going to see the mother of all the trade negotiations as they try to imagine what their future trading relationship is going to look like. Can you explain all of this to us?
So first I have to say that my views are my own because of the role that I have. And also we're in a period of purdah, as they call it in Britain, strangely, which means the election is in process. So I'm going to be very careful in my remarks. Also, it happened, I began my career in the Reagan administration working on trade policy. And in fact, my PhD is on exactly this topic, that the purpose of trade policy is to protect competition, not to protect competitors. And so I'd like to step back before I answer the Brexit question and just say, personally, I am in favor of the freest possible movement of goods, capital, and human capital across borders. However, this takes place in the context of politics, and trade policy is always a stepchild of the political arena. So my father was the principal trade negotiator for the United States under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. He personally crafted most of the agreements that we now fall back on, including the World Trade Organization. And then I personally began my career working on the preparations for the Uruguay round and the Plaza Agreement. One thing we have to keep in mind, trade policy in my father's day was all about numbers. You were negotiating, I want 5% on the tariff, you want 4.5%, let's agree 4 3/4. We did that until we basically hit zero on pretty much everything. The issue by the time I joined the White House in the early 1980s was definitions, not numbers. So the thing that caused the Uruguay round to fail was that no one could agree on the definition, particularly in a world where services were much, much more important than goods. Now, I believe we still can't define services. We still don't have a clear idea of what should the level of tax or tariff be when you can take an entire turnkey power project and put it on a thumb drive. What is the tax or the tariff that you should charge on the movement of that intellectual capital across a border? This is still an open question. So that's a technical point. The next thing is, I entirely agree with our Canadian representative here to say that trade policy and open free markets should never be taken for granted. And what we have done is to assume that everyone, of course, would support this. It is a constant fight that you have to preach that this is the right thing and help people understand why they have a vested interest in it. So we lost that fight mainly for lack of interest. We just assumed it was arrogance on our part. So now today, what we have, when I look at the world economy, what I see is all over the world we have separatist movements. We have people saying, because of the debt problem, the ends don't meet. We can't pay for all the things that are important to us. Therefore, why are you in charge? And the moment they ask that question, they throw out the establishment, they bring in new figures, That's what we've seen with Brexit. That's what we've seen with Trump. It's what we're witnessing in many, many parts of the world. Once we have the new figures in, then they also have to remake the case for what the economy ought to look like, what the rule structure should be. My personal faith and belief is that all the work my father did to create the World Trade Organization was valuable, and we're now going to fall back on that rule system. So worst case scenario, and this is a personal opinion, worst case scenario, Britain will revert to World Trade Organization rules with the European Union. Now, currently, WTO rules govern all EU trade with the United States. They govern British trade with the United States. Now, no one is out protesting that this is a terrible, terrible disaster. Yes, will the tariff rates be higher than they were before for some trade with the European Union? Yes. Does that need to be addressed? Absolutely. But I think what we're going to do now is begin to go test the original framework that we put in place. I do believe the President of the United States is going to fiercely test it by saying, I'm willing to let cases go before the WTO. Let the United States be judged whether it has violated the rules. If it has, there are penalties to be had. This will further engage the public debate on this subject. Is this a nice, easy road to go down? No, it isn't. But here we are on this road. None of us can change this course. The public has voted for a new direction. So my view is let's stop complaining about the wonderful, beautiful, romantic past that we had. Let's roll up our sleeves and start to deal with the future that we can craft. And I do believe, I'll say one last thing, controversial as it may be. When I look at the British economy, which I perceive as an investor and as advisor to investors around the world as one of the most dynamic, fast-growing economies, it is the place that most people in emerging markets are looking to as a safe haven. It is highly competitive in many, many things, including manufacturing, and I say that as a manufacturer. I manufacture robotics in the United Kingdom. Bottom line is, it may revert to WTO-type rules with regard to the EU. I mean, when people say you'll lose access to the single market, look, Afghanistan has access to the single market. The question is, what is the price? The price will change. But it's very interesting to me that the one country the new controversial president of the United States wants to do a free trade deal with is the United Kingdom. And the US is the one country that is growing strongly. So if this forces everyone else to reconsider their free trade deals that they crafted many years ago and perhaps begin to modify them in a way that accommodates this new political environment, maybe we end up with an okay result. So I can't be a pessimist in the face of all the pessimistic reasons one might be.
Start preparing some questions, because I want to turn to the audience in a minute, but I just have to press you on that particular point,
Sure.
because it's unusual to hear from someone based in London optimism about the prospect of a shift to WTO-only rules. And I suppose one reason for that is that although, as you say, most countries in the world, of course, trade with the European Union. They may have a degree of access to the single market, which simply means that they trade with it, but they're not members of it. And yet, Britain, as a result of having been inside the European Union for more than 40 years, has extensive trading relationships that have been constructed on the assumption that it is a member of the single market. So there's going to be a major, at the very least, there's going to be a major transition cost from leaving the single market to having some sort of WTO-only arrangement if you can't come up with a comprehensive sort of free trade arrangement. Is there not?
So here's the bottom line. Businesses are going to have to think, where am I selling? Who am I selling to, and what is the tariff involved in that sale? So businesses that might previously have said, I'm very comfortable, I've been selling to Germany or France for many years, I know exactly what the deal is. Now suddenly that deal isn't there. They're going to have to think, maybe I should be selling to the United States. Maybe I should be selling to some other part of the world. Maybe I should continue to sell to the European Union. Yes, there'll be a higher tariff. But my question as a person who runs a business is, if your business depends on the price of the tariff, if that is alone going to kill your margin, what kind of business is that? Now, if you are in oranges or things that are biodegradable, right? You sell fruit and nuts. These things live on incredibly thin margins, and you can kill a business with a tariff. So I personally think government should pay close attention to sectors where that margin is so thin. But in a lot of other sectors, that's not the case. And what it is an impetus to go tighten up your balance sheet, tighten up your margins, get focused on what really sells and what really doesn't sell. And by the way, the world is your oyster. The EU may have this massive market, yes, but there's still a whole rest of the world out there. The last thing I'll say is one thing I do find a little bit comforting is when you canvass particularly small and medium-sized businesses and you ask them what percentage of your P&L is international, usually it's pretty small. Small businesses need to do much more global business with the whole world, wherever they see the greatest advantage. So personally, I think we have a massive increase in global trade that can happen if we get businesses to focus more on global markets instead of just the easy market at home.
Okay, thank you. I want to take one or two comments from the audience now, if I can. Please, sir. Got a microphone over here.
Alan Riley, Institute for Statecraft. I suppose inevitably one ends up having to talk about the Brexit stuff, which really one doesn't really want to. But the difficulty with this is that I would like to have your optimism. And in fact, I could be optimistic. I read a paper about how to do hard Brexit. I said, if you're serious...
Could you put the mic a bit closer to you?
Okay, if you're serious, you would do it over 10 years. You wouldn't even trigger Article 50 until the 2020s, and you'd restructure the British economy. Because essentially, the entire economy is built around the single market. And let me give you one example of how difficult it is this. This is from Vice President of Ford Europe a couple of weeks ago in Tallinn. And what he said was this. Dagenham makes more or less all of Ford's car engines in Europe. They face a 10% tariff on the car engines if they're outside. But that's only the beginning of the problem. Those cars, which are produced in Slovakia or Germany or wherever else, they're able to then be sold outside the EU under the 54 EU free trade agreements on the basis that there's sufficient European content. But because the British engines are such a large part of the content, they will not be able to rely on the EU FTA tariffs. So you're not talking about an FTA with just the EU. You're talking about 54 tariffs, 54 FTAs. And that is just one example in one sector. And the word that the Ford guy used, and he was doing it in a kind of way which I suppose is not to say catastrophic, he said it was existential. But the problem is that when you go through sector by sector, you take if you take Ryanair and EasyJet, who are facing having to expel their British shareholders because they will not remain EU companies and they then can't do point-to-point transfers within the EU airspace. Or you take simply mutual recognition, which means that telecom and data companies cannot function within the EU. They don't have their licenses. So we're advising on this sort of thing. So we're saying you move to Ireland. And that means the tax revenue walks out of the country. One of my jokes about the British election is that we have all of these political parties basically offering spending commitments. And the real issue in the election surely is this. Given the tax base is leaving the country, how do we cut public expenditure or increase taxes? That should be the real issue of the British general election. Yeah. And the real point about all of this is when you start, it's so difficult to be optimistic about this because no one is being realistic about where the United Kingdom starts from. And I think that is the real danger here. And I think the inability of the political and administrative class to talk about it seriously and about what our options are is going to cause I would say some political problems as we go forward, whoever wins the election. And I think it's that context. I am by nature an optimistic person, but how on earth can you structure any optimism when we have a complete lack of reality about where we are starting from?
Okay. Thank you for that burst of pessimism to counter our optimistic panel. Do we have any comments from the audience, ideally not on Brexit at this phase?
Great.
Or any questions? Not yet, no. Okay, so who wants to follow up? Hold on, Pippa, I'm going to give it to someone else first.
Very quickly, I just want to say, when India opened up its markets in 1991, It did so because they faced a complete crisis and they had 3 days of reserves. I sat down with Manmohan Singh at that time and I said, what are you going to do? And he said, we have no choice. We have to throw this economy open to market forces because we have 3 days of reserves left. When New Zealand did exactly the same thing and threw their economy open to market forces, it was because they had 3 days of reserves. That's a crisis. That forces the business community to completely change how they do things. This is the soft version. This is the nice, easy version, where you have time, not your decade, but you're not faced with your back to the wall in that situation. I just want to be clear about context. Nothing creates more radical change than a crisis. We're going to see people do things and do them faster and smarter because it's a crisis. Crisis, Raymond Barre once said, I was in a conversation with him and I said, oh my God, but we're going to have a crisis. And he smiled and said, yes, that is how we get a solution.
That's a
you
crisis
don't have
we could have
solutions
avoided,
first.
Philippa? We could have avoided that crisis because I think it's...
But we didn't avoid it, did we?
it's a crisis
It's too
which
late.
is wasted, if you ask me.
It's too late.
Okay. Carol, go ahead.
Yeah,
I mean,
but you should have used it as an argument during the referendum. Vote for us, we'll create a crisis.
No, I agree, but I don't think that was a great point either. But here we are. We cannot reverse time.
But also the other thing I wanted to say to you was say what is the UK? It's mainly services. It's a goods importer and it's a services exporter.
Agreed, totally.
And about 10% of its GDP comes from the financial services sector, which is extremely international, which is not the SMEs. No, they are extremely international and they benefit from services trade with the rest of Europe. Essentially, on top of that, services has hardly been liberalized by the WTO. I mean, they have been liberalized at European level, but not at the WTO level, because there are huge barriers at the WTO level, which we also have in the agreement with CETA. I mean, there are many provisos on services trade, even in the CETA agreement in EU and Canada. So I'm grim at my prospect for the UK, and I would agree with you. Let's say they were just built on the single market model.
Yeah. Okay. We focused largely on Europe and Britain so far. What about Asia? A lot of Europeans, a lot of officials in Brussels like to point to the speech that President Xi gave in Davos early this year. Look to him for a new champion of a global trading order, which might be perhaps a little bit of a stretch. But in the meantime, although America has withdrawn from the TPP, I think it's the 11 other countries are seeing if it can be salvaged from the ashes, if something can be salvaged. Negotiations are ongoing with the RCEP between ASEAN and 6 other Asian countries. So if we're looking for places to be optimistic, if we don't think we're going to find them in Britain, if we don't think we're going to find them in Europe, might we find them in Asia?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons why it was so important to succeed with CETA. I mean, if the EU is unable to negotiate an agreement with Canada, when they will be able to negotiate anything?
Yeah.
And the same a bit for Canada. It's much easier because Europe is a democratic world, about the same kind of economies. We want, as a government, to see what kind of free trade agreements we may negotiate with Asia, China, or the other countries. But it will be a huge challenge because it's not always democracies we're talking about.
Exactly.
And so all the difficulties we had about rights for workers, protection of the rights of government to regulate for the good, will be much more complicated. But at the same time, imagine if Canada protect NAFTA as much as possible, have CETA, and an agreement with Asia, what kind of great situation we will be from a geopolitics perspective.
And on NAFTA, what is at stake here for Canada? I mean, clearly, probably the most important trading partnership the country has ever signed. It's not at all clear what this American administration wants to do with it, but it wants to renegotiate it. What does your government see? What is at stake here? What do you need to protect?
We are not demandeurs. It's not us who want to renegotiate it. But if one partner of NAFTA wants to renegotiate, we will be ready. Mm-hmm. We will be ready. We'll show in which way NAFTA has been beneficial for everybody, while keeping the capacity of Canada to stay Canada. We have still a healthcare system different than the United States. Worker rights are different, and so on. It's not true that trade created a kind of uniformity where we have been trapped as a country. So we'll be well equipped to show to our American friends how much both of us are beneficial through trade, and in which way this agreement has integrated our economies. We cannot imagine that, let's say, Mexico should be pulled out of it. It would be a very complicated thing to do. Last point, a very simple example. Lobsters from Maine, lobster from Atlantic Canada. All of a sudden, the lobster of Canada will be much more competitive on the EU market. Because, no, the gap is important. And when you have these tariffs gone, all of a sudden Canada will be much more competitive. That's a key advantage that you may do door to door when you will be the governor of Maine next time about trade.
Yes. Okay.
Barry. Yeah. I mean, I think on this issue of NAFTA, just sort of following up on that, I mean, this is sort of and speaking as an American now, someone who sort of watched how the American public and studied how the American public perceives trade. Last year, or I guess a good way to start is a few years back, Americans passed a piece of legislation called the country of origin label. It was calling for a country of origin labeling. This is for meat. And it just meant that when you went to the store, when you went into a grocery store, if there was a piece of meat lying, in the cooler, you could see where that piece of meat came from. Did it come from the United States? Did it come from Canada? Did it come from Mexico? Did it come from Brazil, Argentina? It's like in our clothes, we have a law that says, it's like you look in the back of your T-shirt, and well, it came from China or Bangladesh or Vietnam. We want the same thing for our meat. That got passed. This is something, it was like greater transparency. It was something that the people in the United States wanted. The large companies there's really 4 companies that dominate about 80% of beef sales and beef business in the United States. They didn't like this at all because these are all global companies or international companies. They have operations in Brazil. They have operations in Canada. They have operations in Mexico. They actually manage the flow of goods across borders. There's not open trade. There's no market between these companies, these countries. They're trading companies that move these animals and these products across these borders. And this country of origin labeling legislation, this interfered with, it created a cost for them and it interfered with their ability to move this product as they saw fit across these borders. So then these companies went and they enlisted 2 governments to take a case in the WTO. One was Canada and the other was Mexico. Now, were these really representing Canadian cowboys? Were they representing Mexican cowboys? No, they were representing their own selves. And, but I know a bunch of cowboys. I work with a bunch of cowboys. I work with ranchers. I work with farmers. And I can tell you, one of the things that made them very, very angry the last year was the fact that their country of origin labeling, this protection that had been allowed to them so that the people who consume their meat know where it comes from, had been taken away from them. And these are a lot of the people that went out and voted. I know it. You saw those counties, all those rural counties, all those rural districts going red in this last election. I know those people. A lot of these people were Democrats. They voted Democrat their whole life, and they voted for Trump in this last election because they were angry at this action that had been taken by Canada and Mexico at the behest of not their citizens, but of international corporations.
Okay. Hang on, to go back to the audience now. We had a question here in the front. You can, and I see a couple more. If you could come to the front here first.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the stimulating discussion so far. I'm from Australia. I'm the Australian ambassador in Vienna, and we're no strangers to free trade and economic liberalisation. So firstly, I want to thank Europe because Europe precipitated the crisis that drove us to open our economy decades ago by undermining our trade with the UK and through the Commonwealth. So we did that. We've just gone through 26 years of continuous economic growth, despite all of the global and regional crises which have occurred during those years. We have one of the most open economies in the world. We have a free trade agreement with China, one with Japan, one with Korea, one with the United States. And we have trade agreements with many other countries, and we were right at the front of trying to get the TPP over the line, and we didn't quite get there. But you're right, we are trying now to pick up the pieces on that and do deals with others. Coming to the question, we do want to do a free trade agreement with the European Union, and we've started the process of doing that. But I'm just going to be brutally honest here. We are buckling up for what we think will be quite a long and difficult process. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, but there is a lot of protectionism in Europe, particularly in sectors which we're strong in, like agriculture. So my question is, although people talk the talk in Europe, how serious and committed are you really to this, and how committed are you to opening up to the rest of the world, not just specifically Australia, but the rest of the world?
Thank you. And this might be a bit unorthodox, but I want to ask you a question. We often hear from some of the more gung-ho Brexiteers that there's a very bright trading future for Britain, which lies outside of Europe. In some cases, it lies inside the Commonwealth, and Australia is a country that we often hear about. How much excitement, if any, is there in Australia for striking a comprehensive trade deal with Britain once the terms of trade between Britain and the EU have become clear?
Okay, well, there's two parts to my answer. The first thing I would say is that it took a bit of thought on the part of our government, but before the Brexit vote was taken, we did come out as a country and say that we did not think leaving the EU was a good thing for the UK to do. So we did that in concert with the then Prime Minister and the government of Britain. In terms of doing a deal, a free trade agreement with the UK outside the EU, well, of course. I mean, it's not. We don't see it as a zero-sum game. We'd like to do a free trade agreement with the EU and with the UK. Are people sort of licking their chops about it? I think it's going to take a long while for the situation to settle down enough for the UK to do deals with anybody, and I suspect there may be some other countries which are ahead of us in the queue.
Okay, thank you very much. There are a couple of questions in the back. If we could go to those, and then I've got you as well, sir.
Hi, glad to be a member of this, to participate in this forum. And I'm Su Ge, the president of China Institute of International Studies, the think tank attached to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. 5 years ago, I was the Chinese ambassador to Iceland, so that counts. First a brief comment. Just now, Philippa mentioned and tries to give her a beautiful definition of the word crisis. I'd add our Chinese contribution. In Chinese, we have one word for crisis. It's actually made up by two Chinese characters. One is danger, opportunity. Yeah. And you have danger, and you are pushed. And as Xi Jinping said, that China is for globalization. And he compared globalization to the vast ocean. He said that we were plunged to the sea by the West, so to speak. We didn't know how to swim and almost got choked, but we managed. Now that's the way to go. Well, my question is regarding the, just now you mentioned the Master of Ceremony, you mentioned Brexit. And of course, some people from the audience may also express optimism or pessimism. My question is, well, we used to think of London, of course we hope we still do, as financial center of the world. And just take one example, in the financial city in London, it handles OTC, RMB, over the counter. 57% of all Chinese OTC is handled in that little spot alone. Now with that, you can take that as a springboard from London then to Europe if you are a member of the EU. But if you are out of it, so my question for Philippa is, you think that in the future, London can still hope to be the financial center of Europe or only one of the financial centers in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, could you just pass the microphone along to the gentleman? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jonathan List from British Influence think tank. I suppose the question is about the UK having to conduct a lot of free trade agreements in a very short period of time, not only to to renegotiate the ones it already has through the EU, but then also the new ones. And I suppose that could mean that the UK is up against the wall and that other countries will be able to exploit it because it knows its vulnerability. So how can the UK work against that in order to secure it doesn't sort of get exploited or get bad deals? And I suppose that I could perhaps ask the ambassador as well, how might CETA look different perhaps? If that's something that you could comment on, would it perhaps involve more services? And a sort of a general point, you mentioned Asia, sort of Africa. I did a report just before the referendum on the Commonwealth and trade in relation to Brexit, and looked a lot at the economic partnership agreements. And there are a lot of myths about the EU trade with Africa that are perpetuated by many people in the Commonwealth as well. So it's kind of it's about public opinion. For example, the most enduring myth, I think it's a myth, is that raw materials are not subject to tariffs, but if you process them in Africa and then export them, then they are. Now, the EU insists that that's a myth, but that endures, and which has turned a lot of people against free trade in Africa and other developing countries. So how do you work against that if you're promoting free trade against a kind of a tide of populism, which is maybe in favour of protectionism? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then just one more here. The microphone's just there. And then we'll go back to the panel.
John Roberts with me, thanks. It's fine to talk about Brexit in terms of the mainland of Britain, but what about Northern Ireland? Can I ask you, given the way that politics intrudes, it is almost inconceivable that you could have a return to a hard border in Ireland, given the way in which the various peace agreements that came into action were based on, in effect, the removal of the border for all practical purposes. Does this mean that in order to have any kind of exit from the European Union, that de facto Northern Ireland has to somehow radically change its economic and commercial trading relations with the rest of the UK in order to ensure there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
Thank you very much. We'll go back to the panel. I mean, a whole cluster of issues there, a lot of them Brexit-related, not all of them. But Pippa, why don't you start, because there was a specific question directed to you,
Sure.
And then we can go to whoever else wants to pick up on the other themes.
So, first of all, the question of will the City of London survive as a financial center? I think the answer is yes, but what it depends upon is a simple thing. I was the chief currency strategist for Bankers Trust, the deputy head of global strategy for UBS. I spent most of my career in the city. Money is like water, and it will flow to wherever it faces the least resistance. Wherever you have the lowest tax rates, the least regulatory red tape, that's where it's going to go. To your point, sir, about everyone will move to Ireland because of the tax, well, we'll see what happens with the EU case against Apple. Because if, in fact, that goes the EU direction, then the tax rate in Ireland will be the same as the rest of the EU, and then nobody is going there. So my question to the British is, are they going to lift their taxes and their regulatory environment to be more onerous than the EU, which I personally would challenge the British to do because I think it would be an awfully heavy lift. But if they manage to do that, then they will lose Britain as a financial services center. If they remain in a competitive environment, then I don't think that people will leave. Although there are new advantages to be had from being inside the EU. So some of the financial services activities will move. I'm just saying not all of them will move. And as someone who worked in that environment, I welcome that competition. Why should London have some kind of monopoly over being a financial services center? It should be competitive. It should have to face competition from the rest of the world. I just think that as trade people, we overlook the fact that so much of that depends on the infrastructure of tax and the regulatory environment. One other thing, when we get a chance, now is not the moment. I think it's also very important. People in the trade world, they think only in terms of trade. They're not thinking in terms of all the other aspects of the negotiation. One thing Donald Trump is doing is everything is on the table. Strategic security issues, trade issues, and he will trade one for the other. So it's a much bigger game than just this narrow little silo that we tend to operate within.
Okay. Stefan, I think you were mildly shaking your head.
I hope we have done our best in the last days to dissociate the fact that the UK is leaving the EU and the UK involvement in NATO. This must be
different.
Completely different. I hope we'll not mix up everything. About Canada and Brexit, the issue for us is twice. First, twofold. First, we had the habit to use the UK as a porte d'entrée for Europe. And it's by far our main trading partner. So now if Brexit becomes Brexit, it will not be the case anymore. So it's a bit why the Prime Minister appointed me the special envoy for Europe. We need to develop a strategy that we did not do in the past. And in this way, I agree with Philippa that it will put us in the obligation to think otherwise, to adapt to a new world. So we need to be strong in our ability to trade with Germany, with the Netherlands, and Italy, and so on. For the EU countries, it will be quite easy to go in Canada. It's an Anglophone market, close to the United States. For us to understand Europe, which is still a very contrasted economy despite the single market, it will be a challenge. And we need them to be good for that. That's the first point. The second point is to negotiate with the UK, because we want to stay strong in our relationship with the UK. But you cannot negotiate now, because the UK is still in the EU, and we don't know what kind of agreement it will be at the end of the day between the UK and the EU. So we need to wait to see which part of CETA may still apply to the UK, and at that time you start to negotiate, and hopefully it will not take 7 years as it took with the EU.
Do you have any advice for your Australian colleague who's about to embark on a serious discussion with the European Union, having completed it after 7 years?
Oh, it's for me the question?
Yeah, well, you have a colleague over here, a Commonwealth colleague, who is concerned about some of the political forces in Europe as Australia embarks on trade discussions with the European Union. What's your advice to him?
Be very patient. We don't have the ratification yet, but we'll have provisional application in the coming weeks. And the tariffs will be gone. And at this very moment, I'm confident that people will see that a lot of their concerns will not. And then they'll be more courageous and willing to negotiate with Australia. It was key to succeed with Canada.
And perhaps engage in a bit of outreach to the Wallonian Parliament as well.
Yeah, but that's where this court statement from this week was so important, to say that only on the non-trade part of it, they can block it. They cannot block it on the exclusive EU-related competences, which is trade. So on that, of course, in response to your question, let's say the EU is protectionist, yes, to some degree, but they have no developing a whole series of bilateral agreements. But I would ask the question to you, is the US not protectionist? I think the US is more protectionist than Europe is. If you ask all the European banks how they fared in the United States and how they still continue to fare in the US, how difficult it is to have access to the US market, because US applies its laws extraterritorially. We have seen it in the LIBOR cases and in the Euribor cases. I mean, there were cases, fines imposed on European banks because they cleared under US dollar, and that's why, I mean, US law applied. But also think about the other big trading bloc in the world, China. How open is China for us? I mean, I know, again, best the financial services data. The market share of foreign banks in China is 1%. And that 1% includes HSBC, for example, which is the largest foreign bank in China. But imagine 1%, but it's not only that. I mean, there are so many sectors of industry in China where you cannot have access. And if I look at these free trade agreements, which have been concluded by many countries already, but China, I think it's pure diplomacy. Of course, probably with the exception of Australia. But look, Switzerland has a free trade agreement with China. Who's the biggest counterfeiter of Swiss watches? China. Why have they concluded a free trade agreement with China? I don't know what is in there. So I think it's only something symbolic, diplomatic, nothing more.
Okay, Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to. This conversation keeps coming back to the idea about that maybe that the challenge is to figure out how to trade more with each other. And I actually want to put out there the idea that the challenge is actually to figure out how to manage the system of extreme interdependence that we have already built, that we have built over the last, certainly over the last 20 years, but really over the last 70 years. And we're having all this conversation about Brexit and how difficult it's going to be to sort of manage this breaking away. You know, is 2 years not enough? Do we need 10 years? We have a system, however, I just want to, yesterday, last couple of days, there have been a couple of very close encounters in the South China Sea. There, a U.S. ship sailed very close to one of these fake islands. The China, we have fake news. We now have fake islands in the world. So the Chinese have built a fake island. And they're using that to sort of claim territory around this. The United States says no, that's not an island, and we conduct an exercise within the supposed territorial limits of that island. Then the day after, there was a very close encounter between Chinese and American planes in the South China Sea. If any of these sort of near conflicts become an actual conflict, if one of these near conflicts becomes an actual conflict that leads to a break in trade, anywhere in the South China Sea, it could be between Japan and China, could be between Korea and Japan, could be between China and the United States. If there's any major break in trade, it all comes down. Everything comes down. It comes down in a matter of hours. It just comes crashing down. Now, going back to the beginning of the interdependent system. The interdependent system, as many of you in Europe know, goes back to the coal and steel agreements. And what was the coal and steel agreements were, well, we're going to make it really hard for either for the Germans or the French to rearm, because we're going to take the key for armament, which is the steel industry and the coal industry, we're going to put them under common control. And that way, it's creating a break. Now, the rest of your economies, you work on that. We're not going to try and take this too far, but we're going to create an interdependent system in steel and coal, so that passions can't go quickly out of control. Over the next 50 years, 45 years, we kind of gradually increased interdependence among our nations, but always with a lot of breaks in that system. What has happened over the last 20 to 30 years is radical concentration of vital capacities, keystone capacities, in certain places. Certain kinds of semiconductors are made only in Hsinchu in Taiwan. Others are made only in South Korea. Others are made only in Japan. Now, if you look at this as a system, what you see is multiple single points of failure. There is no backup for these. You cannot turn a faucet someplace, and the semiconductors are not going to come pouring out of a factory in California. They're not going to come pouring out of a factory in Germany. There is no backup. So here we are. We have, Tom Friedman, who some of you probably know his work, The World is Flat. He in that book, he said, no two nations that share a vital supply chain will ever go to war. Now, I know the folks who worked with Barack Obama these last 8 years, and Barack Obama believed that, and Barack Obama pursued sort of trade policy based on that idea. The United States has actually been engaged in this idea that extreme interdependence equals peace and prosperity. But when extreme interdependence of the type we have today, what it means is that there is absolutely no room for any kind of error whatsoever, because if there is an error, a miscalculation by any nation, it could be the Japanese, could be the South Koreans, it could be the Taiwanese, could be a terror actor, an extra state actor. Any miscalculation, or potentially a conscious, intentional action by someone who means to disrupt the system, brings it all down. So I would just say that the challenge for people who really care about trade in the West is managing the system that we have to make the system more redundant, more resilient, to break these monopolized concentrations of capacity.
Thank you.
So I have to say, I totally agree on this. I wrote a book about this last year. Xi Jinping and Obama signed a memorandum of understanding that prohibits the military pilots on both sides in the South China Sea from making obscene hand gestures at each other while flying. Now, how close do you have to see the other guy? How close do you have to be to see the other guy's obscene hand gesture in a fighter jet? 40 feet, max. So this is how close we are. And that's why I think it's very important to understand we may not like Trump, But understanding his negotiating strategy is critical. So when he said to the Chinese, I'm going to hit you by labeling you a currency manipulator, and then begins a dialogue about, well, let's talk about the South China Sea. Let's try and decelerate what's happening there. And by the way, we in the United States would like our infrastructure upgraded, but we don't really want to pay for that. And you're doing one belt, one road. How about you bring one belt, one road to the United States, and we won't label you a currency manipulator. We'll work with you on decelerating the South China Sea. Now, maybe we're attributing too much intelligence here to the new president, but what I see is a negotiation by a real estate guy who says everything is on the table. And that's why I said we have to be very careful not to be too siloed in our understanding of trade policy. We're dealing with a president who has no respect for precedent, who says everything is up for negotiation. So I'm not saying it will succeed. I'm just saying it's a different way of thinking about this.
Okay, fingers crossed. Okay, we've got a couple more questions here, right in the back here. The woman's, yep, please.
Thank you. I'm Neelam Dev from Gateway House in Mumbai. If I may come back to Brexit and the Commonwealth for a moment, the first country that Prime Minister May visited after she became Prime Minister was India. It didn't go well with the government, and both sides were, I think, upset with each other. But of course, it isn't only governments that trade. And I can tell you, living in Mumbai, that Indian companies, many of which had invested and set up offices in the UK, are actually considering how to move out without too much loss and without disrupting what were existing and easy business practices. So if maybe if there could be some more discussion of what's happening with companies, not just from India, but from other countries as well, who have had their base in the UK for a long time. A couple of banks, I think, have announced that they might be moving out.
Okay, thank you. Then the gentleman here, I think? No? Okay. The ambassador wanted to write a reply, and then... Excellent, okay. and then one here, and then I've got a question I want to add as well. So we'll go to the ambassador, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so very briefly, replying to your point, we have a very good free trade agreement with China. In fact, it's pathfinding, and hopefully, if we can get it to work well, we can get a lot of agricultural trade and a lot of services trade and provision of services in China. If we can get it to work properly, it should open the Chinese system to doing more agreements with larger economies than ours, because we've got a small enough economy not to be threatening to China. So they're trying, and we have a gentleman here from China who may comment on that. We also have a good free trade agreement with the United States. So sure, there's protection in these economies, but these governments are doing free trade agreements, and we're able to do our agreements with these countries much quicker than the 7 years or however long we're thinking it might take to do with the EU. Secondly, on the South China Sea, which is a major preoccupation for us, yeah, it is a very dangerous situation. In fact, being at Globsec is quite fascinating because obviously Europe has its own internal security dynamics and some very serious issues with Russia and so on and so forth. But just to repeat something I've said earlier here, the long, big game with China is the big global game. And those sea lanes which go through the South China Sea carry some massive percentage of world trade. So keeping that area safe and secure is a very, very high global priority, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Sir.
Yes, thank you very much. Ivan Ivach, Aspen Institute, Central Europe. I have two short comments and two short questions. First of all, this debate is about globalization and protectionism. 90% of it is about Brexit. We have to start thinking also in a different dimensions. I'm very surprised that we go always in this way down. I have been running for 13 years the European Automotive Industry Association, and we have been fighting every single deal that has been negotiated by the EU with anybody. With the Koreans, with the Canadians, with the Indians, with the Japanese, you name it. The only deal that we have ever, negotiations that we have ever supported, together with the Americans, was the TTIP. I remember we were the first industry that in fact endorsed the negotiation on the TTIP. Now, I have two questions. One to you, Philippa, and you can answer also both. We have not spoken about TPP. What is the future of the TPP? What is the future of the region which Trump, by throwing the TPP, almost finished into the wastebasket has left to the Chinese. The Chinese president immediately in Davos has mentioned, we are free traders. We are here, so what? So is it 11 plus 1, 12 plus 1? What is it in the future? And the second question is, despite the fact that we didn't finish the TPP and the TTIP, TTIP, lots of things have been negotiated and we have made a progress. Do you see a way how we can pick up the bits and pieces that are laying around, glue them together, probably not in a comprehensive deal, but in something that resembles a limited TTIP? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Also to Carlo.
I know there's more questions, but I will come back to the audience. I just want to add a question of my own on TTIP, which is on a slightly different aspect. When before it was put into the deep freeze over the last couple of years, an argument for TTIP that we sometimes heard was not really an economic one, but a strategic one. This would cement the transatlantic alliance. It would mean that Western liberal democracies were setting the rules, were setting the terms of trade, and that other large trading partners, particularly China and other Asia countries, would be forced to follow. I'd be interested if any of the panelists have a view on that, and if it means, therefore, now that this deal at best is in the deep freeze, whether we are sort of ceding some of the leadership to some of these countries. So we've got that question on TPP, a question on Indian companies based in Britain. So who wants to pick up some of these? Pippa, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in. I have a view on this, but it's a very unusual one. I think part of what has caused these trade deals to fail is that the technocrats, of which I have been one all my career, the technocrats believed that it's all about the details. But what they lost track of is if the leaders can't stand behind broad principles and aren't seen by the public to be doing so, then we can get all the details right and lose the leaders and lose the public along the way. And I think, having canvassed a lot of the negotiators on TTIP, that may have been the main thing that happened. That, in fact, we could fix this by going back and elevating the discussion to the level of principles. And then you can deal with the details. Now, I appreciate, as a business person, the details are the thing everybody cares about most, because that's where the rubber hits the road with money. And I'm not in favor, by the way, I'm no big believer in these big G7 meetings where everybody gets a lot of photographs but not a lot gets done. But I am saying that there is a role, there is a place for political leaders to be able to rally behind principles. And we haven't seen that on trade. In fact, what we've seen are our political leaders increasingly stepping back from that as we go through this populist wave. And until our leaders are believers and stand behind the principles, it's hard to see how the details get negotiated.
Okay, thank you. Barry, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to actually, I agree with everything Pippa just said, and just I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. And this discussion is somewhat premised on the idea that the people, operate, sort of following populists, following demagogues, are disrupting this beautiful system. I actually think that it was the elites that disrupted this system, and they did it in 1994 and 95 with the particular version of Uruguay that we passed in 1994 that led to the WTO, with the particular vision of the WTO that we have, which essentially shifts control over this system from the people's government to private government. And ever since, this has been approached as something that, we don't want the little people to touch. We don't want the Congress to touch it. We're going to turn this over to the experts and let the experts handle this because, gosh, it's like the people will screw this up. The people in most of our countries did trade pretty well for a long time. And we built, in the 50 years after the war, we built an amazingly effective system for sharing out both benefit and responsibility, across the OECD nations. And there were flaws in that. The flaws were that one flaw was that it did not extend to the rest of the developing world. but it worked amazingly well, and that was the people's governments doing what Pippa was talking about before, which was negotiating directly with one another and making sure that pain and opportunity and benefit were all shared out well. The neoliberals, the elites, the plutocrats, they are the people responsible for the place we are in now. And we should follow the people's lead in sort of breaking down the present system and moving towards a new and better system.
Thank you. Before I go back to the audience, we had specific questions on both TPP and TTIP, and does anyone want to pick up on any of those?
I want to take up on TTIP. I mean, I'm not. I would follow Filippa's line, let's say, on reading a bit, trying to understand, let's say, the Trump presidency, and of course there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of shouting, but in the end what I hear already in Brussels, and those which are following this like you, I mean, we're here, bits and pieces are already being discussed, very low key. Of course, there's hardly anything in the media, and it may be that initially we'll have some bilateral agreements like we have in Switzerland, by the way, specific agreements for specific sectors. I heard they were negotiating pharmaceuticals or something in the car sector, and they will do this quietly. There will not be in the media, and probably, who knows, let's say that in 3 or 4 years' time, 3 years probably, Trump will need something for his re-election. He will say, look what I've done. And in the meantime, people will have forgotten, let's say, that he was against in the first place. So I think that may happen. But of course, like you say, Simon, I think personally, let's say the most important part of this agreement is that we have a way to discuss with the Americans, Europeans with the Americans on a continuous basis, all our differences to avoid trade wars like on cheese or on chicken or on whatever, let's say, like we've got in the past. And that, I think, is the most important thing, which we now have with Canada, by the way, let's say, which is extremely important. If you read the Canada agreement, you constitute many different committees to discuss about regulatory harmonization and technical problems and tariffs and many different areas. So these Canadian and EU officials meet all the time. And that's what we need with the Americans as well. That's, by the way, what we will miss with the Brits. And that's what the Brits do not realize. The moment they leave, and if there is a hard Brexit in 2 years, the Brits will be just absent everywhere. And they are today in thousands of committees and so many different things where we discuss all whatever very boring things for a broader public, but they will be out of that. So what is the thing, let's say then, to respond to that question, let's say on the person from India, let's say the companies will no longer have the access which they have, like for Canada, by the way, like for Japan, like for India, which they have to the EU market through London or through the UK today, because they were part of that regulatory harmonization. They won't have that single passport anymore, or they won't have that single statute to trade a product from the UK or a service from the UK and the rest of Europe, because the agreement is no longer there. And that is the biggest problem. And on top of that, I think a big issue which is often underestimated is the free movement of people as well. So whatever, the Japanese, Indian, Canadians who are working in the city will all of a sudden no longer have this free access to the European market, and vice versa, which includes many high-level professionals, or they will need to have special deals. I mean, it's all forms of additional barriers which we're building to trade. So that's what I wanted to say, probably in a nutshell. Yes,
okay, great. Okay, I'll get Stefan, and then we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'll make one final round to the audience, and then we'll wrap up. So
if
Stefan.
the US don't want a free trade with the EU, it's fine for us. We don't see it. Too bad for them, but it's fine for us. About the Asia, as I said, it would be great for Canada. We're a country at the Atlantic, a country of the Americas, and of the Pacific. So it would be great to have a free trade agreement like the TPP. But not any agreement. You need to look at that very carefully. So we were reviewing this huge agreement when President Trump decided to pull the plug. So I'm not saying any free trade agreement is a good thing. I agree that we need to look at that very carefully, and there are certainly things that we need to review always and never take it for granted. I'm arguing for progressive trade, not any trade. A trade that is a race to the bottom for the protection of our workers, of our farmers, of our environment. It's a big mistake. But a word about the environment. I'm very green myself. I'm known in my country for that. I lost an election on a carbon tax. So I think we have today a self-destroying development. We are destroying our planet and putting at risk the next generations. But I think as well that Canada and other countries, humankind, has a tremendous capacity to innovate. And we need to free this innovation. We need to be sure that any innovation will be spread right away. And for that, we need trade.
Thank you. Okay, we've got just over 10 minutes left. I want to take as many people as I can, so please, please, please keep it brief. I've got the woman just here. And maybe keep your hand up so I can see you.
Okay, Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. I want to follow up on the Australian ambassador's comments. Pippa, you mentioned how Trump is, this kind of tabula rasa. He's unprecedented. We don't know how he's going to negotiate. But this is actually very dangerous. We saw what happened with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. Mm-hmm. He spoke to him for a couple of hours, and after he left the meeting, he announced that Korea really was Chinese after all. So having no background, not understanding anything, and having the newest leader whisper into his ear can really be dangerous for U.S. policy, especially U.S. allies. And in regard to coming up with some sort of interesting trade deal with the islands, we had a decision in July. We're talking about globalization, so the constitution of trade really is movement on the oceans. 90% of trade is done by ships. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, there was a hearing. It was decided that within the 9-dash line, China has no rights to that. So these artificial islands, it's clear. So the fact that Trump might not understand that and make some sort of deal about these islands is a bit odd, but it's dangerous that he doesn't understand. So I think even though it's an unprecedented approach, it's very dangerous for the international community because that has already been decided, that China does not have a claim to that area. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sir, did someone here? Okay, please, yeah.
Well, somebody mentioned the South China Sea. I thought I was going to remain silent, and then the ambassador had a second chance, so that I raised my hand. Thank you very much. Actually, I would like just to supply a little historic fact, because I'm also a product of globalization. Had my education, graduate schools in the United States. So use this opportunity and research through libraries, national archives, and gain a little historical record. So we should be, China should be thankful for her rights to some of the islands in the South China Sea. Because the United States, after the Second World War, because Japan was in occupation of some of the islands. Your government then told the nationalist government, even before I was born, go ahead and get these islands from the Japanese. But the nationalists said, we do not have ships. Then somebody in the government thought of your law called land and lease. So we borrowed 8 destroyers. 4 of them were used to recapture these islands from the Japanese. So the name why Taiping Island is named Taiping, because the destroyer we borrowed from you was named Taiping, and so on and so forth. But anyway, so now for the United States and China, we want to be friends, want to be partners. Not only for the mid-air collision agreement, and there was a sea agreement. That is, if there is 2 ships coming from different directions, each side is going to move to the right-hand side and leave at least 1 mile in between. So a lot of thunders, but very little raindrops. So South China, so let's keep it calm down and keep it peaceful. And so cooperation is the only correct way for our 2 countries. Okay, globalization, just one word.
Very briefly,
very briefly. For FTA, when I was ambassador 5 years ago, when I was about to leave, and we were able to reach an FTA agreement with Iceland. I hope you still regard Iceland as one part of Europe. So the question is, if anybody from the European community, Australia, Canada, United States, anybody who is serious on reaching the FTA, let us know, because we are a think tank belonging to the Chinese foreign industry. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan, wait for the mic. Keep it brief if you could.
Okay. This is a non-Brexit question. One of my concerns about the WTO system created in '94, which we were talking about earlier, is the extent to which China has been a free trade pirate on the system. And one of the staggering, I think, observations about Chinese piracy is that up until the date that China joins in 2001, the Chinese economy progressively opens. Once they join, and certainly from 2006, the market closes. FDI finds it much more difficult to enter, market opportunities close, regulatory structures become tougher. And isn't one of the real underlying questions about the if you like, the value of the WTO and the sense of its lack of legitimacy, which leads to the Trump election, is in large part the trade piracy and the unwillingness of the WTO institutions and the West to face China frankly on that issue?
Thanks very much. And did we have one question? Yes, this will be the last one, and then we'll go back to the panel.
John McCarthy, I'm an Australian. I work as an advisor to part of the Mitsubishi Group. I'm formally in the same game as Brendan. I think this question is probably for Pippa. You've talked very cogently about the way Trump does business and the way that he might bring all the elements to the table, which is unusual in negotiations, trade here, security here, and so on. What do you think that Xi Jinping's bottom line would be in such a deal with Trump? That's an easy question and a hard answer, but give it a try.
Okay, thanks very much. So what I'll do now, we have less than 10 minutes left, so maybe I'll go to the panelists in turn, and you can combine any answers you want to give to the questions we had with some closing statements. So, Pippa, why don't you start? Last question was directed to you, and we'll come this way.
These two questions come together. So, and I hate being in the position of having to explain and defend Donald Trump, but I'm going to have a go. So, he has appointed as the U.S. ambassador to China Governor Branstad. Who is Governor Branstad? Xi Jinping's best friend from the age of 17 when Xi Jinping went to the United States. Who is running the dialogue behind the scenes? I do believe Ivanka is having close conversation with the Chinese ambassador in Washington. How do the Chinese like to do business? Family. Family is a big thing for the Chinese. So when the president said North Korea is Chinese, my personal interpretation is that it isn't that he got his history wrong. It is that we are having a crisis in North Korea right now. And the president's approach so far has been to say, when there's a big crisis somewhere, to the Russians, Syria, if you want it, you go deal with that. You have it. Ukraine, if you have issues there, that's no American interest. North Korea, China, you want it. You go deal with it. Next thing we know, the Chinese sending troops to the border to deal with the potential porousness and refugee issue. The Japanese announced their willingness to accept 52,000 refugees should the circumstances arise. So I think that whether we like it or not, no one is going to stop this president from taking this unprecedented path. Although I say that, I think, frankly, in history, we have had moments where we've had strategic security and trade and a number of other things all on the table up for negotiation at the same time. We just haven't operated, as Barry, you point out quite rightly, the system has been very siloed in so many different ways. So that's what we're used to.
Okay.
And I'm sure if I were working in the White House, as I did once, I would be palpitating at the way the president is taking all sorts of things that you normally never put together and leading them into one negotiation. But on the other hand, that is the person the public has elected. This is what we're going to have. So I don't see any way. There are those who believe he can be impeached out of this position, and we'll see. But until he's gone, we have to deal with this.
Okay, Barry.
Yeah, just taking on what Alan said about the WTO in the West, and I guess this charge that we failed to sort of respond to Chinese trade piracy. I mean, I would say the WTO was never built for that, and that's actually part of the point. In terms of the West, I actually want to just flip that sort of perception of like who's at fault. You know, I mean, Donald Trump goes around and he blames the Chinese, he blames the Mexicans, he says the Mexicans are stealing our jobs, the Chinese are stealing our jobs, and no, not true. Chinese are not stealing our jobs, Mexicans are not stealing our jobs. Very large American corporations and banks and financiers are taking our jobs, taking our security, and selling it. They're shifting these things to China. They're shifting these things to Mexico. These are decisions that are being made by these very large corporations, these very large financial institutions, largely outside the realm of political debate. So it's like whatever we see is not something. It's not because the Chinese are bad actors. It's not because the Mexicans are bad actors. It's because the financiers and these monopolists in our system. We have given them too much license to do with ours what they will. Now, in terms of a fix, I actually, just a real quick, let's end on like a positive note, like what we can actually do. And what I want to do is point a finger at something that Ronald Reagan did in the mid-1980s. I mentioned before how Ronald Reagan sort of imported sort of libertarian concepts into American antitrust law in the early 1980s. He did not do that with trade law. And in the mid-1980s, after an antitrust suit in the United States had resulted in IBM spreading out all of these different technologies that were inside the personal computer, the Japanese made a play. Japanese state in cahoots with the Japanese corporations made a play to capture control over all of these technologies, semiconductors and all these kind of other components. Ronald Reagan at that time and his people, they had a couple of different ways they could respond. They could let it continue to happen. They didn't want to do that. What they did is they said, they could also try and bring it all back, just put up a big wall. And they said, no, we don't actually want to do that either. Instead, what they did is they put on tariffs, they put on quotas, and then they went to the trading companies, the manufacturers. They went to IBM, they went to Compaq, they went to Hewlett-Packard, and they said, the easiest thing is if you just don't continue to buy only from the Japanese. You should spread out your purchasing. Do not be dependent on one source. Go to Korea. There's a little company called Samsung up in Korea. Buy from Samsung. Go to Taiwan. Buy from TSMC. And that one action led to, it was a hard action by a government, and it led to the distribution of capacity, the distribution of opportunity, and the establishment of a system that was marked by resilience.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Carol, some concluding thoughts briefly.
Simon, I only had a response, for example, to the Northern Irish question, which I didn't respond to, but that brings us back to Brexit, if you don't mind. I mean, just to say that it's not Northern Ireland which has to reorient. I think it's Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, which has to reorient, because it's living from trade predominantly today with the UK. And if we have mostly agricultural trade, so if we have a tariff with the external border, it will be 12 or 14%. So that's huge. So Northern Ireland will have to reorient. And how they will do it, I don't know. So the Brexit question for the Irish economy is a really existential question, apart from also the political problems which may emerge in Northern Ireland.
Okay, Stefan, bring us to a close.
I don't know what Brexit will do, but we may all agree that it's much more difficult than what the proposal was at the beginning. And up to now, it has not been so much, it seems to me from the exterior, as an observer, a debate between the EU and Britain. It has been a debate within the British society itself. It's not an easy one. I think the countries that will succeed during the next 3 decades will be the ones that will be able to negotiate free trade agreements that will be what I have called progressive trade. Not only the tariffs going down, but also protections for everything people care about: the environment, the healthcare, food safety, workers' rights, agriculture. That's true that it's negotiable. And I would argue that an example of it is CETA. And I'm very proud that we have been able to negotiate it. And now our task is to prove that it works, in order to give courage to people that it's possible to have trade and progress all together.
Thanks very much. And on that note, we'll have to bring it to a close. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thanks very much to the audience for your great questions. And please join me in thanking the panel. And we have a 30-minute refreshment break now. I think refreshments served on the ground floor in the hotel. And the next session will be on the future of war, starting here at 3:30.
Don't like my diamond chains, 'cause stand the way I dance. Everything